He wrote the song the world sings at funerals, at weddings, at the end of a life well lived. But behind the lyrics of My Way was a boy who learned music from silence, a son who lost the only voice that ever truly knew him. This isn't the story of fame. This is the story of what it cost. Before the world heard his voice, one woman taught him what love sounded like. Long before the spotlight found him, before stadiums echoed his lyrics, and millions carried his melodies in their hearts, Paul Anka was simply a small boy in Ottawa, listening. He was born on July 30th, 1941, the first child of Andrew and Camelia Anka, immigrants who carried with them not only memories of Syria and Lebanon, but the quiet resilience of people who had crossed oceans for a future they had to build with their own hands. Ottawa in those early years was cold in the winter, modest in its pace, and humble in its opportunities. Yet inside their small apartment above the family restaurant, there was warmth, the kind that came not from money, but from love. His father, Andy, ran Locanda, a neighborhood restaurant where the air was thick with steam, spices, and the rhythm of work. The days were long, the nights longer. Andy worked with calloused hands and a stern kind of affection, the kind that didn't need words. He believed in discipline, responsibility, survival. Life was always about the next morning, the next meal, the next dollar earned and spent. But in the kitchen upstairs there was a different world. It was Camelia's world. She was soft where the world was harsh, gentle where life was sharp. She hummed Lebanese lullabies as she cooked, her voice drifting like sunlight across the room. Paul's earliest memories were not of toys, noise, or crowds, but of her voice. The sound of a mother singing while stirring a pot, folding clothes, or sweeping the floor. Her melodies didn't need lyrics. They simply felt like safety. To Paul, music was never something he learned, it was something remembered. He would sit near her feet, small hands folded, listening as if the sound itself was explaining the world to him. And in many ways, it was. Those lullabies taught him what comfort felt like, what emotion could sound like, what longing could become when given a voice. At 11 years old, Paul joined the choir at St. Elijah's Orthodox Church, where incense filled the air and sunlight filtered through colored glass in quiet pools. There, surrounded by voices rising in sacred harmony, he discovered something deeper. Music wasn't just sound, it was presence, it was prayer, it was a way to speak without needing to explain. The choir conductor would say he had an old voice in a young body. Paul didn't sing to impress. He sang to belong. In each trembling note, he searched for connection, for a home inside himself. Yet, even with love at home, there was a kind of loneliness in him, a restlessness, a longing to be seen not just as a boy, but as someone meant for something beyond the edges of the city he grew up in. The world outside felt too big, too distant, yet somehow calling to him. He watched travelers come and go from the restaurant, listened to stories of places he had never seen, and wondered where his own path led. In school he was quiet, gentle, thoughtful, the kind of child who felt everything deeply. Teachers noticed his sensitivity, his attentiveness, but not yet the gift that waited in him like a seed under snow. But his mother saw it. She saw the way he listened, the way melodies stayed in his chest long after the world had gone quiet. She understood that his silence wasn't emptiness, it was preparation. Sometimes, late at night, when the restaurant downstairs had gone still and Ottawa slept under winter frost, she would sit beside him as he drifted toward sleep, her hand on his chest, her voice soft as breath. "Listen, Habibi. The heart always sings first." He didn't know it then, but she was, giving him the one lesson his entire life would be built upon. That music is not made in the throat. It is made in memory, in loss, in love. And for a time, love filled every corner of his world. But childhood is a brief season, and life has a way of rewriting every song. The melodies that shaped him, The voice that taught him tenderness, the warmth that turned four walls into a home, would not always be there to guide him. The world was preparing him for a silence he did not yet understand, but the music that shaped him would soon vanish into a silence he was never prepared to face. Every legend begins with a wound. For Paul, that wound did not come suddenly. It came slowly, quietly, like dusk creeping across a familiar room. In the late 1952, when Paul was just beginning to understand who he was and who he might become, his mother, Camelia, began to fade. Not in dramatic ways. There were no sudden hospital emergencies, no loud revelations. Instead, her illness moved like a shadow. A tired breath here, a fainting spell there. Days when she hummed less, smiled less, rested more. The woman who once filled their home with warmth now seemed to be holding on to her strength as if it were slipping from her fingertips. Paul felt it before anyone said a word. He noticed her footsteps growing slower, her hands trembling slightly when she passed him a plate at the dinner table. He began lingering near the kitchen doorway, listening not for music this time but for silence. Silence felt dangerous. Silence meant something was changing. His father noticed too, though he did not speak of it. Andy was a man who believed that bearing pain quietly was a form of strength. He continued running the restaurant, long hours and steady hands, as though routine could keep the world from cracking. Paul respected his father, but he did not understand him. Andy held things in. Paul felt everything. Camelia, despite her fading strength, still tried to shield her. Son. She still hummed, still touched his face gently, still whispered encouragement into his hair. But the notes of her lullabies grew thinner, softer, as if carried from farther away. For Paul, the emotional distance between his parents widened too. With his mother, love was spoken in warmth, laughter, touch. With his father, love was spoken in the language of responsibility, quiet expectation, and unspoken burdens. One parent sang to him, the other taught him to stand. Both would shape him, but in very different ways. By the time Paul was 19, just as his career was beginning to form and the world was beginning to take notice of his gift, Camelia's light finally dimmed. She passed away at the age of 45. There are losses that feel like the closing of a door. This was not one of them. This loss felt like the roof of the world had vanished. Paul did not cry in loud, dramatic bursts. He didn't break down into someone's arms. Instead, he carried the loss the same way. Music carries silence quietly, constantly, everywhere. He once said that after she died, he felt as if he were singing into a space where she used to be. Her absence was not emptiness. It was an echo. That echo became the core of his writing. When he sang of longing, it was her. When he wrote of hearts breaking, it was for her. When he spoke of love that fights to survive, he was trying to keep her memory alive. The world heard melody. He heard memory. Songs such as Diana and Put Your Head on My Shoulder may have sounded like teenage love songs to those who listened. But beneath every lyric, beneath the soft vulnerability of his voice, there was grief, gentle, aching grief, trying to find a home. Pain did not destroy him. It transformed him. Loneliness became his muse. Heartache became his language. Silence became the space that shaped his sound. And while others sang to entertain, Paul sang to remember. His songwriting did not come from training, or study, or imitation. It came from trying to hold on to something that life had taken from him. His mother had taught him love. Her absence taught him meaning. This is why his voice never sounded like performance. It sounded like feeling. A boy who had loved deeply. A young man who had lost deeply. An artist who would turn that loss into something eternal. But grief does not stay still. It does not remain a memory tucked in the past. It becomes motion. A restless inner pull toward something larger, louder, brighter. So, at 19, carrying the weight of the music that silence had left him with, Paul Anka made a choice. He would not stay in the small apartment above his father's restaurant. He would not bury the echo of his mother's voice beneath the routines of everyday life. He would chase the world. If love shaped his voice, loss would drive him to chase the world. He didn't chase fame. He chased a place his heart could finally rest. After his mother's passing, the Avendarise, the apartment above the restaurant, no longer felt like home. The walls still held the warmth of her voice, but now the silence was heavier than sound. Paul couldn't sit still inside it, not emotionally, not spiritually, so he began to look outward. And outward, for him, meant away. At 14, while other boys were thinking about school dances and baseball games, Paul was waking up before dawn. He delivered newspapers with cold wind burning his cheeks. He wiped tables downstairs after school, his hands smelling of bread, dough, and dish soap. Every tip, every spare coin, every small earning went into a glass jar on his nightstand. He wrote one word on that jar, Los Angeles. To anyone else, it sounded impossible, a fantasy, a child's dream with no map to follow. But to Paul, it was not a dream, it was destination. A place where songs were born, where voices were heard, where the silence inside him could finally be answered by music. He wasn't trying to escape his life. He was trying to continue the song his mother had begun. By 15, the jar was half full. That was enough. He packed a small suitcase, just a few shirts, a pair of shoes, and a stack of handwritten lyrics folded into a notebook. He hugged his father with quiet respect. No dramatic goodbye, no promises, just a young boy leaving to find out who he might become. And then he boarded a bus heading south. The ride was long, the nights were cold. He slept sitting up, his cheek pressed against the rattling window. He watched the landscape change, snow fading into open fields, fields giving way to dry highways and sun-beaten roads. His heart didn't race, it didn't flutter. It simply pulled him forward, like a thread being reeled toward something inevitable. When he arrived in Los Angeles, the city did not welcome him with glamour or opportunity. It was not golden. It was vast, hard-edged, indifferent. The sidewalks were hot, the buildings loud, the people busy and unreachable. Paul was 15. Alone, unknown. He slept wherever he could, a borrowed couch, a diner booth, sometimes on stairs outside small clubs. Meals were inconsistent. Some days he stretched a cup of coffee to last hours, convincing his stomach it was enough. But hunger didn't frighten him. Silence had already taught him what real emptiness felt like. So he sang. Anywhere they would let him. Church basements, school auditoriums, community halls. Sometimes he was paid in coins, sometimes only in applause, sometimes not even that. But applause was never the point. What mattered was the feeling. The moment when he opened his mouth, and the world, even briefly, listened. He carried demo tapes to radio stations. Receptionists smiled politely, then refused. He knocked on club doors. Bouncers shook their heads. He wrote letters to producers who never wrote back. Every day was rejection. Every rejection was a test. It would have broken a heart that chased fame. But Paul wasn't chasing fame. He was chasing the memory of belonging, the belonging that lived in his mother's voice. And so, rejection, instead of stopping him, shaped him. He learned to wait, to try again, to enter through a back door when the front one closed, to stand when the world told him to kneel. Persistence was not a skill he developed. It was the language of his grief. Eventually, someone agreed to let him record a song. His first single, Blau Wild de Bahn, came and went in silence. It barely sold. Some didn't even understand the title. Many didn't care to learn it. For a moment, disappointment flickered across his spirit. But only for a moment. Failure didn't scare him. Silence didn't scare him. He had already faced the deepest silence a boy can face. So he did what only the truly destined do. He kept writing. He kept singing. He kept believing. day after day, club after club, until even the city began to change. Not because the city softened, but because he grew harder, wiser, and hungrier. His voice grew richer, his songwriting deepened. His understanding of longing became unmistakable in every note. He was no longer a boy, searching for a place to belong. He was a young man sculpting his identity out of pain, hope, and memory. And then, one night in a small, dimly lit room, far from family, far from home, far from the safety of childhood, Paul picked up his pen. He thought of a girl. He thought of love that felt just out of reach. He thought of the ache of wanting something more. And he began to write, word by word, line by line, until the silence broke and the world changed keys. The song wasn't meant for fame, it was meant for someone's heart. In the summer of 1957, in a small room with a cheap desk and a single lamp flickering weakly against the night, a 16-year-old boy sat with a pencil and a trembling kind of hope. He was not writing for the world. He was not writing for applause. He was writing for her. Her name was Diana Ayub, a girl 5 years older than him who worked at the local church. She was beautiful, confident, graceful, the kind of girl whose laughter stayed in a room even after she left. Paul admired her the way young hearts admire things that feel just out of reach, quietly, fiercely, desperately. He knew she didn't see him the way he saw her, but he also knew something that she did not. He had a voice that could carry feelings when words alone could not. So he wrote. He wrote about longing that was too big for his age. He wrote about love he was not brave enough to confess aloud. He wrote about the ache of wanting to be chosen. I'm so young, and you're so old. This, my darling, I've been told. The lyrics came with the force of something that had been waiting inside him for years, something that knew how to rise only when love hurt a little. He finished the song in a rush of emotion, hardly aware of the significance of the moment. All he knew was that he had put his heart into words for the first time in his life. He brought the song to a local record executive, not with confidence, but with sincerity. And sincerity, as it often does, found its way. ABC Paramount listened, and they said yes. The recording session was quick, raw, imperfect. Paul's voice was young, trembling with innocence and urgency. The production was simple, just enough music to cradle the emotion, not drown it. When the record was pressed and sent into the world, nobody expected much, not even Paul. But the world was already waiting for him. They just didn't know his name yet. The song caught fire. It didn't rise slowly, it exploded. Within months, Diana was playing everywhere. Jukeboxes in diners, radios in parked cars, dance halls, drive-ins, school gyms, living rooms. Teenagers clung to its yearning. Girls cried when it played. Boys felt seen in its ache. By the end of the year, Diana had sold over 10 million copies, becoming one of the best-selling singles in the history of recorded music. A 16-year-old boy had turned his unspoken longing into a global anthem, and the world began to chant his name. Paul Anka wasn't just a singer now. He was a phenomenon. His face appeared on magazine covers. Girls lined up outside theaters before sunrise. Fans screamed his name with a hunger that only youth knows. When he stepped onto stages, the air itself seemed to vibrate. Crowds didn't just applaud, they ached for him, voice cracking with emotion, hands reaching, tears flowing. And behind him, the industry surged in his wake. Tours filled stadiums, merchandise flew off shelves, radio stations raced to premiere his next single. He was one of the very first global teen idols, before the Beatles, before Elvis became myth, before the word celebrity meant what it means today. He traveled from New York to London, to Tokyo, to Rio, sometimes performing 250 shows a year. Hotels blurred together. Time zones dissolved. The crowds screamed louder than the thunder of applause. And yet, in the quiet moments, backstage, In empty hotel rooms lit only by city glow, he felt alone. Because the love of millions was not the same as the love of one, he had given the world his voice. The world had given him its applause, but applause cannot hold you. It cannot sit beside you. It cannot say your name the way someone who truly knows you can. He was adored by everyone and known by almost no one. Even as magazines printed his smile and cameras captured his every gesture, and there was still a part of him that was just the boy from Ottawa, the boy who listened to his mother's voice and learned that music was a home you carry inside you. The crowds saw a star, but he saw a child searching for the place where love once lived. And the world, for all its devotion, is not built to hold one person's heart forever, because as fast as it falls in love, it learns to fall in love with someone else. The world fell in love with him, but the world is quick to replace its idols. Success isn't permanent, not even when the whole world sings your name. For several years, Paul Anka lived in a world where every door opened, every audience rose, and every melody he touched seemed to turn into memory. His songs were everywhere on radios, in dance halls, in the hearts of teenagers who taped his picture beside their mirrors and whispered his name into their pillows at night. He had conquered the dream most people never even get to chase. But no era lasts forever, and no spotlight burns without flickering. The early 1960 seconds arrived with a sound that would shake the world, not softly, not gradually, but like a tidal wave crashing through the house of popular music. That sound was the Beatles. Their arrival did not just introduce new music, it changed the rules of the art form. The culture shifted overnight. The young no longer wanted clean suits and tender ballads, sung with open hearts and earnest voices. They wanted electric guitars, wild hair, and poetic rebellion. They wanted music that broke things instead of holding them together. Suddenly, the soft sincerity that had made Paul a global sensation was considered old-fashioned. The industry that once chased him now turned its eyes to Liverpool. Concert halls that once thundered for him now echoed with empty seats. Record labels that once begged for his songs now said, "Not this sound, not anymore." Radio stations that once played him on repeat now pushed him late into the night, or not at all. It wasn't personal. It was cultural gravity. Generations turn like seasons, and Paul had become a voice of a season the world was leaving behind. He fought to adapt, but reinvention is not a skill the young often know how to wield. His tours grew smaller. Shows moved from arenas to theaters to lounges. The hotels lost their luxury. The money slowed. And somewhere between the collapse of one contract and the struggle to negotiate another, everything he had built began to unravel. But failure does not always arrive with noise. Sometimes it comes quietly, like sand slipping through fingers. Paul had invested heavily in a business venture, one he believed would secure his future beyond music. It was a calculated risk. It was supposed to be a safety net, a foundation. Instead, it collapsed. And with its collapse went nearly all of his earnings. Years of touring, performing, writing, hustling, gone in what felt like a single breath. For the first time since he boarded that bus at 1:05, he felt something he had spent his life trying to outrun. Fear. Fear of irrelevance. Fear of being forgotten. Fear of losing not just success, but the purpose that made him wake up every morning. He could have stayed in America and watched the industry move on without him. He could have become a nostalgia act, an echo of a decade the world was already mythologizing. But that was not who he was. When life closed in, he did what he had always done. He moved forward. He went to Paris, not as a star, not as a sensation, but as a man beginning again. Paris was different from Los Angeles. Less noise, more soul, less ambition, more reflection. He walked along the bridges of the Seine at dusk, watching the water glow with the reflection of old street lamps. He wandered through narrow cafes, where men argued about philosophy over cigarettes and coffee. He sat alone at windows, notebook open, pen hovering above blank pages. He was not writing for charts anymore. He was writing to understand himself. It was a quiet fall, so quiet that, to the outside world, it did not look like falling at all. People assumed he was just taking time away, resting, vacationing, living slowly. But inside him, something was unraveling and reforming at the same time. The part of him that had once written Diana out of longing was now writing out of survival. Paris became his cocoon. And transformation rarely happens in light, it happens in shadows. One evening, in a small hotel room lit by the dim glow of a single bedside lamp, he turned on the radio. A French melody washed through the room, a song titled Comme de Habitude. It was raw. It was solemn. It was a song about a man losing himself to routine, to aging, to the quiet erosion of love. The melody struck him like a memory, like something he had heard long ago, though he knew he hadn't. He recognized the emotional truth in it. He felt it in the same place where his mother's lullabies once lived. He sat down at the small wooden desk, opened his notebook, and began to write. Not a translation, not an adaptation, a rebirth. He wrote about defiance, about self-definition, about living on one's own terms. Line after line poured out with the urgent clarity of a man who had known love, loss, glory, and silence, and survived all of them. When he finished, he knew what he had created. But he also knew something else. This song was not meant for him. His voice could not carry the weight it held. This was a song that needed a legend, someone who had been celebrated and scarred, worshipped and wounded, someone whose life had been lived in full measure, someone like Frank Sinatra. In a dim hotel room, he found a melody, but it needed a voice greater than his own. Sometimes you don't perform the anthem, you write it. In that quiet Paris hotel room, surrounded by the soft hum of a city that always seemed to be dreaming, Paul Anka held a melody that didn't yet belong to him. Comme de Habitude, a French ballad about routine, resignation, and the quiet erosion of love, had struck him with the force of memory. The song was aching, beautiful, but incomplete. It was a confession without a conclusion. Paul didn't want to translate it. Translation would have kept the story tied to someone else's heart. He needed to reshape it, to bend it towards something larger, more universal, something defiant, something true. He thought of Frank Sinatra, not the icon the world worshipped, but the man he had come to know in dim clubs and private dinners away from the stage lights. Sinatra was charismatic and commanding, yes, but he was also tired, worn by the weight of decades in the spotlight. He was considering retirement. The world still saw him as immortal, but Paul had seen the cracks, the quiet moments, when Sinatra looked not like a legend, but like a man who had lived 1,000 lives and was still searching for peace. This song wasn't just for Frank, it was Frank. So Paul began to write. The pen moved almost faster than his thoughts. Words poured from memory, loss, triumph, ego, regret, and pride, with a clarity that only comes when a person has already lived the truth they are trying to express. And now, the end is near. He wasn't writing about endings, he was writing about dignity. I've lived a life that's full. He wasn't writing about pride, he was writing about accountability. I did it my way. Not arrogance, assertion, a statement of ownership over one's own existence. By dawn, the song was finished. 4 pages of lyrics that would outlive every stage, every concert, every decade to come. Paul looked at the pages and knew this was no ordinary composition. This was a man's life in words. But it was not his voice that could carry it. So he called Sinatra. Frank listened, silent, still. And when the final line landed, Sinatra looked up and said, "Kid, that's me." Recording the song was not just a studio session, it was a coronation. In the booth, Sinatra didn't sing the song. He inhabited it. He bent vowels, held pauses, let silence sharpen meaning. His voice cracked in places not from weakness, but from truth. He didn't perform the lyrics, he confessed them. When the track was completed, the studio fell into a hush. Everyone present understood what had just happened, even if the world didn't know it yet. And then the world heard it. My Way did not climb the charts. It installed itself into human history. It became a funeral song, a wedding song, a retirement song, a personal anthem, a declaration, a farewell, a vow. It crossed generations, cultures, borders, languages. It became the soundtrack of selfhood. From New York nightclubs to Manila karaoke bars, from small-town weddings to royal ceremonies, from immigrant shopkeepers closing up at midnight to legends taking their final bow on stage. Everyone who heard it believed it belonged to them, because it wasn't about Frank Sinatra or Paul Anka anymore. It was about the universal human desire to live on one's own terms. Paul had not just written a song, he had written a mirror. In that moment, Paul's career transformed. He was no longer just the teen idol with the charming smile. He was no longer just the voice behind Diana. He had become something far rarer, the architect behind legends. He wrote She's a Lady for Tom Jones, a firestorm of brass and swagger. He would later collaborate with Michael Jackson, co-writing This Is It. He composed the theme for The Tonight Show, a melody America welcomed into its living rooms every night for more than 30 years. He didn't just stay relevant, he evolved into the very structure of music itself. But this achievement, this rebirth of identity, came with a quiet irony. The more the world celebrated him, the farther he drifted from the life he had once cherished. Success has a cost that fame rarely warns you about. A cost paid not in applause, but in absence. Night after night, he returned to hotel rooms instead of home, airports instead of dinner tables, spotlights instead of embraces. The boy who once wrote songs to belong now had a life no one else could enter. The world had given him everything he thought he wanted, but something was missing. Something warm, something familiar, something he thought he would always have. Love. But the louder the world applauded, the quieter things became at home. A man can conquer the world and still lose the place he calls home. Paul Anka had written songs that wrapped themselves around the hearts of millions. He had stood under lights that burned like suns and heard his name chanted by crowds that seemed endless. But in the end, it was not applause he longed for. It was peace, a quiet place to put down the weight of being Paul Anka. He found that peace in Paris, in a moment gentle enough to be missed if fate hadn't insisted he notice it. Her name was Anne de Zogheb. She was working as a model for the French edition of Elle magazine. Elegant, graceful, not loud in beauty, but calm in it. She had a quiet kind of presence, a steadiness, a softness that felt like home. Her heritage was a blend of Lebanese, English, and French roots familiar, enough to feel known, different enough to feel new. When she smiled, her eyes smiled first. The first time Paul saw her, he wasn't struck by lightning. He was disarmed, as if something in him recognized something in her. Not the world's Paul Anka, but the boy who had once listened to lullabies in the kitchen above a restaurant in Ottawa. They talked, not about fame, not about success. They talked about family, faith, food, and childhood. They talked about ordinary things. And in a life that had become extraordinary to the point of exhaustion, ordinary felt miraculous. They married in 1,963 inches, a small ceremony not designed for cameras, not configured for headlines, not meant to impress. It was quiet, intimate, a promise spoken softly. Anne brought him something he had never had before, a place to land. They built a home in California sunlight, trees, space for laughter to echo. And soon, the laughter grew louder. They welcomed not one, but 5 daughters into their Alexandra, Amanda, Alicia, Anthea, Amelia. 5 small lights, 5 different personalities, 5 reasons to put the world aside and come home. Paul, the man who had toured endlessly, began to travel differently. He would rush from airports to school plays, from studio sessions to birthday dinners. He wrote songs backstage and then folded paper hearts into lunchboxes. He was known around the world, but at home, he was simply Dad. He once said that his favorite audience wasn't 10,000 people in a stadium. It was 6 faces around a dinner table. The golden years were real. Laughter in the kitchen. Late-night bedtime stories. Tiny drawings left in his suitcases so he wouldn't feel alone on the road. Anne created a home that felt whole, complete, balanced, safe. For a while, it seemed like Paul had achieved the impossible. He had both the world and a place to come back to. But fame does not live quietly. And even when it whispers, it changes the air in a room. Paul's schedule slowly began to expand again. Tours, television appearances, residencies, collaborations, award ceremonies, recordings. At first, it was manageable. He would be gone a little longer, then a lot longer. The girls grew, their needs changed. Life became faster. Anne stood at the center of the home, holding everything together, the routines, the quiet, the grounding. But Paul was increasingly living in the spaces between home and the world. He was present when he could be, but also absent in ways that couldn't be seen from the outside. There was no dramatic fight, no betrayal, no scandal, no breaking point. The distance arrived the same way her illness once did, quietly, slowly, unnoticed, until it was everywhere. Love does not always end with anger. Sometimes it ends with fatigue. 2 people still loving each other, still caring deeply, still respecting what they built, but realizing they were no longer living the same life. Anne waited for him in silence. Paul looked for home in applause. Neither meant to abandon the other. Both did, little by little. Their daughters felt it. Children always do. Birthdays became video calls. Holidays became scheduling negotiations. Dinner conversations became polite check-ins rather than long, wandering memories and laughter. Anne once told a friend, "We built a beautiful life. We just forgot to live in it together." By the mid-1990s, the emotional thread between them had thinned to a whisper. They still spoke gently, still respected each other, still loved their daughters fiercely. But they had been living on parallel roads for too long. After 37 years of marriage, they quietly divorced in the year 2000. There were no public accusations, no headlines dripping with shock, no venom, just 2 hands slowly letting go. Paul later said, "When she left, I felt like a song that lost its bridge, still beautiful but broken." He didn't talk about it on stage, didn't turn it into a lyric, didn't rewrite the story. He simply carried it. He visited the home they once shared and found it full of memory. He looked at photographs of the early years and felt time folding in on itself. He learned how absence can echo as loudly as applause. The world didn't notice much. To the public, he was still Paul Anka, the legend, the writer of My Way, the master of melody. But privately, he walked through rooms that no longer felt like home. And when Anne passed away years later, in 2017, he paused before speaking about her. His voice trembled. "There's a part of me that still lives in 1963. The part that believed love could stay forever. The part that believed home could be permanent. The part that never imagined silence would return." For a moment, grief reminded him of his mother, the first silence that shaped him. And now, silence had entered his life again. But this time, he wasn't 19. He was older, more weathered, less certain. And heartbreak, he now realized, was not something life taught once. It was a lesson that returned in new forms, in new faces, across years that had been both kind and cruel. He thought heartbreak was something life taught him only once. The hardest stage he ever stood on was a courtroom floor. After the quiet unraveling of his first marriage, Paul Anka found himself in a chapter of life most men reach only after fame has faded and the spotlight has cooled. A chapter defined not by achievements, but by reflection. He had known the roar of the world, the blaze of applause, the sweet ache of adoration, and he had known silence, deep, familiar, ancient silence, the kind that waits for you in empty rooms. He lived alone for a time. The house echoed differently now. The laughter of children had become memory. The places where Anne once stood held shadows more than presence. He played music not to perform, but to remember. And then, in the early 2000s, he met Anna Oberg. She was younger, 30 years younger, a Swedish model, confident, radiant, full of a life that moved fast and brightly. To some, the connection seemed unlikely. To others, unbelievable. But love does not always follow narrative logic. Sometimes, two lives touch at a moment when both are simply searching for something new. For Paul, Anna represented a second sunrise, a chance to feel young again, not just in body, but in possibility. A chance to write a new verse, one not shaped by nostalgia or memory. And then, something extraordinary happened. He became a father again. His son, Ethan, was born in 2005. Paul was 64. Most men at that age were slowing down, but Paul felt something surge back to life in him, something he hadn't expected to feel again since the days of tiny hands tugging at his sleeves and crayon drawings tucked into suitcases. He said once in an interview, with a smile that came from a place deeper than words, "He brought me back to earth." Ethan didn't care about platinum records or Sinatra or stadiums. He cared about toy cars, bedtime stories, and his father's arms. Paul began arranging his schedule differently. Shorter tours, fewer appearances, more mornings in the kitchen, more afternoons in backyards, more nights tucking in a child who only knew him as Dad, not as Paul Anka, the legend. Family was no longer something he was returning to. It was something he was building. But life, the great composer, always loves dissonance before harmony. What began with warmth slowly turned into something colder. Paul and Anna's marriage did not weather the same way his first one had. There was no slow drifting apart this time. There was tension, frustration, resentment. Two people living at different speeds, wanting different worlds. Paul had lived an entire lifetime of fame. Anna was still stepping into the world's gaze for the first time. He wanted home. She wanted spotlight. He craved quiet. She craved movement. Arguments. It didn't explode. They accumulated, like dust gathering in corners of a room. Neither of them remembered how to clean. And then, it broke. The marriage ended. Not gracefully, not softly, but publicly. Tabloids circled. Headlines speculated. Their private wounds became entertainment for strangers. But beneath all the noise was the only thing that mattered: Ethan. Because, when the separation came, Anna moved back to Sweden, and Paul faced the one fear that had haunted him since childhood, the fear of losing the person he loved most. This was not about pride, not about ego, not about winning. This was about a father refusing to become a memory in his son's life. So began the battle. The courtroom is not a stage. It has no warmth, no applause, no spotlight. Only truth, testimony, fatigue, and time. Most custody disputes are brutal. This one stretched across years. Lawyers, flights, documents, evaluations, statements, accusations spoken behind polished tables where no one raises their voice but everyone bleeds. Anna's attorneys argued he was too old, that a man in his 70s could not raise a boy entering childhood, that his touring, his legacy, His age, his history, made him unfit. But they did not understand something essential. Paul had already lived a life that could break most men. He had lost his mother. He had lost his youth to fame. He had lost a marriage to time. He had rebuilt himself from ashes more than once. He had lived through storms. This was simply love refusing to surrender. He attended every hearing, every mediation, every evaluation. Some days, grief sat on his chest like a weight. Some days, the exhaustion made his hands tremble. Some days, it felt like reliving every silence he had ever known. But he kept going. A reporter in the courthouse once wrote, "He didn't look like a singer. He looked like a father." And then, in 2017, after 7 long years, the judge gave the final ruling. Paul Anka was awarded full custody of his son. A 76-year-old man standing against the tide of expectation, of statistics, of assumption won. Not because he was a star, not because he was Paul Anka, but because he refused to give up on love. When he left the courthouse, he did not celebrate. He did not make a statement. He did not raise his fists in victory. He drove home, parked the car, sat in the silence, and wept. Not for the battle, for the boy who was coming home. Today, Ethan does not know the legal war that secured his childhood. He only knows that his father is there, cooking breakfast, listening to stories, laughing in kitchens, playing piano in the evenings, letting a child rest his head against his shoulder. This not fame, not accolades, not platinum records, was the greatest triumph of Paul Anka's life. He had written the world's anthem of selfhood. But this time, he did not need the world to see him. He only needed peace. For the first time in his life, he didn't need applause, he needed peace. Some stars fade, others turn into constellations. Today, Paul Anka lives a life that feels less like the echo of fame and more like its quiet reward. The world still knows his name. His music still plays at weddings, in diners, in cars on long night drives. But the chaos, the noise, the chase, those are behind him now. His days begin slowly. Sunlight through open windows. Coffee in a familiar kitchen. A voice from down the hall calling, "Dad." Not legend, not icon, not the man who wrote "My Way," just Dad. In his Los Angeles home, framed records line the walls, platinum, gold, bestseller plaques that tell the story of a man who shaped entire generations of song. But he no longer looks at them as trophies. They are milestones, reminders, footsteps on the road behind him. His net worth estimated to be more than $80 million is impressive, but money was never the point. His estate stretches across manicured lawns and old olive trees. He owns a penthouse in Manhattan with views of Central Park and a quiet villa in the French Riviera where the wind seems to sing through the tiled terraces at dusk. He has collections of cars and timepieces, each tied to memories rather than luxury. But none of these things define him now. What defines him is the boy who once sat at his mother's feet listening to lullabies, the young man who wrote his longing into melody, the father who crossed oceans of time to hold on to his son. Paul still performs, but on his own terms. No more stadium frenzies or relentless touring schedules. Now he chooses intimate theaters, concert halls where every seat feels close and every note lands gently. Audiences are quieter, older, but their love is deeper, the kind that comes from decades of memories stitched together by music. When he sings "Put Your Head on My Shoulder," couples who once swayed as teenagers now sway with silver hair and soft smiles, still remembering what it felt like to fall in love for the first time. When he sings Diana, he doesn't do it as the boy who wrote it. He does it as the man who lived everything that came after. And when he sings My Way, the audience does not just listen, they stand, because the song is no longer just Sinatra's, no longer just Paul's. It is theirs, a song for every person who ever lived their life with courage, regret, heart, and hunger. Paul gives back, quietly. Donations to children's hospitals, scholarships for Lebanese and Syrian students starting new lives, just like his parents once did. Charity concerts, foundations, private checks written in silence. "You can't take the gold records with you," he once said, "but you can leave open doors behind." It is his simplest philosophy, and perhaps his truest. And now there is Ethan. The circle is complete. The music that his mother once sang into his childhood, Paul now sings into his sons, not for albums, not for audiences, but for the simple beauty of a quiet room filled with love. Sometimes, in the evening, Paul sits at the piano, Ethan curled nearby, reading, drawing, or simply listening. The house is still, no spotlight, no microphones, no applause, just keys, just memory, just music. The notes are softer now, but they are warmer too, fuller, more complete, because a man who once searched the world for belonging now is home. He has lived every season that a life can offer. The hungry beginning, the dizzying rise, the public triumph, the private unraveling, the loss, the rebuilding, the return. And through it all, one thread remained unbroken. Music not as entertainment, but as the place where love goes when it can no longer speak. His story began with a mother singing in a kitchen. It continues with a father playing softly in the glow of evening light. The song did not end, it simply changed voices. But one lesson remains, the one he carried, longer than any song.